Noch einmal guten Abend und herzlich willkommen. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie den Weg hierher gefunden haben. Ich bin Melinda und habe die Ehre, Sie heute Abend als Moderatorin zu begleiten. Und wir treffen uns, um ein dringendes Thema zu besprechen. Wie können wir die Energiewende in eine Energierevolution verwandeln? Wie können wir sie fairer, grüner und schneller gestalten? Für diese Diskussion hätte unsere Gastgeber keinen aktuelleren Zeitpunkt wählen können. Bevor ich an ihn übergebe, nur ein kleiner Hinweis. Octopus Energy zeichnet die Diskussion auf, aber wirklich die Diskussion hier vorne. Das heißt, Sie als Gäste sind da nicht zu sehen und bei der Fragerunde machen wir die Aufzeichnung zu, damit Sie ganz offen und viel fragen können. Und nun gestatten Sie mir bitte einen Sprachwechsel. It's a very great pleasure to hand over to our host, an innovator who spent the past 10 years and more doing all he can to work toward a greener and fairer energy future. He's a strong advocate for decarbonization and consumer protection. A British native, he founded the energy startup 400 in 2016, and in 2019 it became part of the global Enertech player Octopus Energy. Please welcome Octopus Energy CEO Andrew Mack. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Crane, and welcome to all of you. Now, I know you've heard of Octopus Energy, but for those of you who don't know the details of what we're up to, please indulge me as I give you a bit of background on what we've been up to. So, Octopus was founded in 2015 in the UK, initially as a pure retail business. And we have two core values that drive everything we do. And the first is to accelerate the clean energy transition in every market in which we operate. And the second that goes along with that is fighting for social justice for energy consumers. And we very, very strongly believe that the energy transition can not only give us cleaner energy, but also cheaper energy, if done well. And over the last 7 years, we've grown a multinational business out of Octopus. We're now active in 9 markets in Europe, in North America, and in Australasia. And we've also moved much deeper into the value chain as we've gone. Today we have businesses in generation. We own wind farms, solar parks, anaerobic digestion facilities across Europe. We install smart meters, we install heat pumps, we install solar PV, we operate demand response as a way of balancing the market, and we even license our own software that we've been building up. So 2 of the biggest energy companies in the UK, E.ON and EDF, both now run on Octopus software. And throughout the last 7 years, we've been very fortunate to attract a lot of investment into the business from Tokyo Gas, who we have a partnership with in Japan, through Origin Energy, who we have a partnership with in Australia, and most recently through Al Gore's Generation Investment Fund, which was a huge vote of confidence in what we're up to. In Germany today, we have over 100,000 customers. We are building our first wind farm. I was talking about this with somebody earlier. If you look that way, several hundred miles beyond the hills, you might just be able to make out a few cranes. But we're currently building a wind farm just near Frankfurt, hopefully the first of very many in Germany. And as of yesterday, we have a heat pump installation business as well. So we're actively installing heat pumps into customers' homes. But enough about Octopus and the past. What I wanted to talk to you about tonight and discuss with Professor Renn and Mrs. Crane is the future and our shared future. And when I think about the future, really, there's one fundamental question that we need to answer, and that is, how do we reconcile the long-term decarbonization process that we need now more than ever with the energy crisis that we currently find ourselves in And in particular, thinking about the short term, how do we deal with the impact on ordinary households across the country? Because I think we've only just reached the tip of the iceberg for what's coming. And come January of next year, there's going to be a lot of pain felt across the country as people's bills rocket upwards. So I think the answer can only come through a dialogue between industry, academia, and government. And I look forward to kicking that off here tonight.
Thank you so much. Andrew, how about a warm round of applause? And exactly, that dialogue is exactly what we want to engage in now with one of Germany's leading experts on environmental sociology and also on energy transformation. He's Professor Dr. Ortwin Renn. He's Scientific Director at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, and he formerly served as Professor of Environmental Sociology and Technology Assessment at the University of Stuttgart, where he also directed the Stuttgart Research Center at Sirius for Interdisciplinary Risk and Innovation Studies. Wonderful to have you with us. And I suggest we do this on a first name basis, given that we are in this wonderfully intimate setting. So if that's all right with you, I'm Melinda. Ortwin, Andrew, great to have both of you here. And ladies and gentlemen, we also want to hear your questions. As I mentioned earlier, we will discuss amongst ourselves for about 30 minutes or so, and then I'll open up the floor. And we're very eager for you to really be part of our dialogue. And I'd like to begin by picking up that crucial question that Andrew posed in his remarks just now, namely whether the Energiewende can really help us out of the current crisis that we face in the short term. And Professor Renn, we all know it, the Ukraine war was a much needed wake-up call. For far too long, Germany and other countries as well have neglected energy security, which of course is now at the very top of the political agenda, with energy sovereignty as well. And the question is, what role green power can play in that? Can it really help us in the short term?
Well, the issue is what is short term. I think it doesn't help us very much within the next few months. It will help us a little bit in terms of increase of wind energy. You just talked about it. Heat pumps, you also talked about this, which can help us definitely to reduce our gas consumption. But if you think about the amount of gas that we are right now consuming and what we can at this point really substitute by solar energy and wind energy, particularly on the heat market, I say that, and on the energy and electricity market, a little different, then we need an interim program that will help us, at least for the industry in Germany, but also for residential heat production, that we need to have some gas somewhere else if we won't get it from Russia. But you're totally right. I think if you think back, and I think there's kind of two numbers that I always like to share. I don't want you to bore you with numbers, but two numbers are very important. Around 50 years ago, Germany was dependent on fossil fuel by around 78%. Now, 50 years later, with all the wonderful wind farms you see even around here, if you look out of the window, we are at 72% in all of general energy. So, you know, the real step forward is now. We need to get from that 72% to zero. That's not just a pretty walk. And the other thing is, we were dependent from primary energy from other countries, and again, if you go 50 years ago or 30 years ago, it doesn't make much of a difference. That is almost the same number. We were something dependent on foreign primary energy by around 76%. Now we are dependent 68%. And this has two major implications. The one thing is that if we're not only dependent on primary energy from other countries, we also monopolized because we put efficiency as number one of everything, that we'd say, okay, we get cheap energy from Russia, and that is, you know, we don't need any other source. And that's what you talked about sovereignty, about, having, not being resilient in the system. And even more so, if you think about the policy of the last 5 years, we have national gas reserves, quite a bit of it. They were all sold to the Russian monopoly. And you can think about, how stupid can you be, if it's a national reservoir that you need in times when things are not there.
Right.
And then you also look at, you observe that just before the Eurasian crisis, all these reservoirs were emptied, to less than 20%, to put us in the position that we can be blackmailed. And I think that's a real big problem. But coming back to the original question, I talked too long, is that, in a short term, we will need liquid natural gas. We will need some of these fossil fuels.
And let me just ask you a very quick follow-up question about another short-term mechanism that you have talked about quite a bit, which is demand management, energy efficiency. How can we leverage that contribution quickly and effectively?
Well, I think one of the things is economic incentives. And economic incentives mean, I think what we do right now is that, we have tariffs that basically are the same regardless whether you consume a lot of energy or little energy. On the contrary, if you're in the business sector, if you consume a lot, you get it cheaper per unit. Well, we need a progressive tariffs. Progressive tariffs means the first 100 kilowatt hours are fairly cheap. It's also about social justice. And then you just increase the price. And if the prices are high on the residential side, but also on the entrepreneurial side, it's a little difficult, more difficult on the entrepreneurial side, I confess. But you can do it. Then you have an economic incentives to be efficient. I think that is very important. And the other point is, which I would call sufficiency, it's not the efficiency side, is that, we have been used to sit in a living room with t-shirt and, 23 degrees, and then have the whole house being warmed up. Well, there is a possibility of sitting in one room and having other rooms a little colder, taking a sweater. I know that sounds like,
Sounds like Jimmy Carter in
patholizing,
1978 after the second oil shock.
Yes, you are absolutely right. But it's a way of definitely. I mean, if you keep your room temperature down by 2 degrees, and if everybody would do it, it could save you up to 18% of your heat. So it's not trivial.
So let me get Andrew to weigh in on the first point that you made, that green power is not necessarily part of the short-term solution. I must say, Andrew, if I look at my colleagues in the media, that is a widespread opinion, that with all excitement about renewables, that these volatile sources and the power they produce are not the short-term solution, they're longer term. Do you see it that way, or do you think there's a fallacy in our thinking, which certainly wouldn't be the first time that my colleagues and I err?
I think the answer is yes and no. I think with the benefit of hindsight, the best thing we could have done over the last 5 years is really double down on building out wind and solar in particular. Look at the number of wind parks that are being built or even aren't being built currently in Germany, onshore and offshore. The whole pace of that industry has slowed right down. And yet we should have been building that up, knowing what we need to deliver over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I think as a country we were a little bit asleep at the wheel. And so now it's easy to look back and say, well, wind and solar can't help us out of this current predicament. That is true. They can't help in the very short term. But the longer we rely on tropes like that, the more we lock ourselves into inaction. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really, really important that even if something isn't going to deliver quickly, that we still push ahead with it and we build up the industry, we build up the supply chain, and we give the market the confidence to keep going.
And I want to talk in a moment about how to do that, but let me also drill a little deeper on something you said. You talked about the need for gas, that we just are going to have to continue to use gas in that short term, partly for grid stabilization reasons. What about nuclear? Where do you come down on that?
Well, I mean, I was a member of the committee in 2011 that recommended to phase out nuclear energy, and I was basically socialized in a nuclear research center. So I don't have any real, bad feeling about nuclear, but I don't think it's a solution. Now, I can live with stretching the 3 nuclear power plants for a couple of months. I don't think that would really hurt it. But in the long run, nuclear, I think, doesn't have a future, even in France in the long run, because it does have a lot of very negative impacts. One is that if something happens in a nuclear power plant, we see this now in Ukraine, in your densely populated area like we live here, you have 10,000, 100,000 people being contaminated. Well, even if the probability is low, you don't want to experience that. Secondly, you have all the nuclear waste. We don't have a nuclear waste disposal in Germany, and there's only one being built in Finland, and there's another one built in Sweden. But anywhere else, it's basically not, it's not there. And thirdly, we have the problem of proliferation. That's not sort of a big problem in Germany, but generally in terms of nuclear energy, that you can misuse nuclear fuel in order to produce nuclear weapons. So I don't think it's a long-term solution. I have no problems if Habeck would have said, okay, we'll keep those 3 for another 6 or 8 months. I think it doesn't have any impact on safety. We should also be aware that all the nuclear fuel rods come from Kazakhstan. It means Russia. So we get the fuel again from the same country that we wanted to avoid. So that's and that's also an interesting story, because when I was younger, working at a nuclear power station, not true, a nuclear research station, we got all the nuclear fuel from Australia, from South Africa, from all over the place, all over the world. Now it's being basically monopolized. Europe is 88% dependent on Kazakhstan and Russian uranium, enriched uranium. And that's, again, a bizarre situation that we want to get rid of gas from Russia and replace it with nuclear from Russia. So it's not the solution, I want to say. Yeah.
So the solution, Andrew has told us, is we need to be serious about scaling up the Energiewende now. That phrase I used a little bit earlier, the Energierevolution, that of course doesn't come from me, that comes from you. Octopus Energy has this in a banner on its website. Tell us what an Energierevolution would mean if we really were to put it into practice. What does it look like? What are the mechanisms? Who has to do what?
No. I think at its heart, it's about really doubling down and committing to what the Energiewende means. And I think we all know it's going to be mostly solar and wind in terms of generation. 2 low cost, very common technologies, easy to deploy. And actually, as we were sponsoring a podcast, and we sent a guy, Andy Crystal, around Germany to talk to people. And he said on his journey, the one thing that really stuck in his mind was he was talking to a professor about wind turbines. And the professor said, look, we should just build this now. And if in 20 years we decide that it was the wrong thing to do, then we'll come along and we'll take them all down again. But we should do it now. Mm-hmm. Because it's just 20 years and we know we need them. And so I think for me, it's that acceptance that we're not looking for the perfect solution. We're not looking to forecast what the world looks like in 20 or 40 years' time, but we have technologies now that we can commit to for the next 10, 20 years minimum, and we should be going full speed ahead on those.
And so, Professor Renn, full speed ahead. Isn't this as much about processes in the end as it is about technologies? In preparing for this panel, I called up a friend of mine who is trying to build wind mills in his forest in the Lausitz. And he has an ideal setup for doing that. And he has been trying for 5 years. And that's not an anomaly. That's the norm. Actually, the norm is 7 to 8, if my figures are correct. Certainly, Robert Habeck has said he wants that to change. It has to change. But is it changing? Are you seeing the signs that we are actually moving in that direction?
Well, I think everybody wanted to move in that direction, and I want to make very clear, and also things about social justice being said. It's not just the population that is protesting against wind energy. That is also an issue, and that's why we think we need better communication, but also better public participation. It's really the licensing procedure. And as you said, it's around 7 to 8 years. I just talked to one of the wind farm producers here in Berlin, another one who said we're now at 8.4 years between the starting of, the planning of it and then the actual execution. The building is 6 months. So we have 7.8 years just for the licensing. It can go faster. I mean, when we built Tesla in the Lausitz, not Lausitz, further north, the licensing was 1.5 years. And so...
Well, they actually didn't wait for their license.
That is one issue. Yeah, they had the money. I mean, no bank would have financed it. But it was not the case that the administration was lax about it. They just said, well, this is a law. I mean, they had to look at it. And they had actually to deconstruct some of the things because it was not according to the regulation. But nevertheless, it's with three things that worked for this very quick. One was, again, risk. He took the risk of building it even without a license, which, you can do if you're rich. But secondly, it was really clear the economic minister of Brandenburg said, this is my absolute priority. Yeah. So all the other windmills were set aside. There is a lack of personnel there. There is a problem that you cannot outsource the licensing to an external, let's say, engineering group or so on, or to another company. It has to be within the administration. The administration is understaffed, so they just, take months and months and months to do of it. Then there is not a clear priority. The issue is that you have to go through nature protection, and there's two different agencies involved. Then you go into the monument protection, and the interesting thing here in the east, Brandenburg, where I live, is that we have a lot of wonderful gardens and parks, but some of them are totally out of shape right now. They all are national landscapes. And within 10 kilometers around these national landscapes, you're not allowed to put a windmill. Yeah. And so any time you put, there's one, no, there is an owl, or there is this, and there is this, and there is this, and so you cannot build anywhere anything. And that, I think, it's an issue that has now been, I think, a little bit overcome because, we get these speeding laws now in place, and I hope they will work. But let me put my first sentence again, because I think that's very important. Also, in terms of acceptance and political peace in the country, you have to do it together with the population. And one thing that is very important now as a sociologist, we've studied this quite considerably. In almost all locations where windmills are planned, the majority is in favor of it. It is always the minority that protests. And I think that's important to know. We still have to talk about the minority. We still have to include them. But at some point, we need to make decisions.
Andrew, have you had direct experience working with these antiquated and very cumbersome licensing procedures? And if so, what do you think? Is it possible to get them changed?
It is. So let me give you an example from when I was setting up 400. So 6 years ago, as I started to put together the business plan and understand what it would take to create a German-wide energy retailer, I realized that we needed to sign individual contracts with each of the network operators around Germany in order to serve any customers within each of those regions. There are 1,400 of those network operators. And 6 years ago, you could only sign a contract in paper form. And so one of the major features of the first year of setting up the business was the postman coming to my door every morning with a cardboard box full of envelopes, typically 30 network operator contracts at a time, in duplicate, paper form, 50 pages. I would sign them, post them back again. A few weeks later, I would get a signed copy back from the network operator. I could then take that contract to another party with another piece of paper and finally get the permission to serve customers in that region. And that whole process could take anything from a month for the quickest network operators to more than 6 months if the network operator really wanted to drag their feet. So I was faced with signing up customers and then saying to those customers, actually, you have to wait 6 months until I'm legally allowed to supply you with energy because there's this paper trail that needs to happen. It might explain partly why there were so few new entrants into the energy market at that time. Fast forward to today, that process is now electronic. So change that always felt far, far off into the future did come. And now one of our team goes through these contracts on a weekly basis, makes sure they're up to date, signs any new ones, but it happens instantaneously. So it is possible to change. It does happen even in our very complicated and often bureaucratic energy market. But it just needs the will, the drive, and as you rightly said, Ortwin, somebody to make the decision and say, this is how it's going to be.
That's about, I don't know how many economists we have in the audience, but that's one of the best descriptions of transaction costs that I have ever heard. Andrew, a lot of what you are looking to do also involves digitalization, far-reaching digitalization. Can you talk a little bit about that and also your experience in that area? Because, of course, we've heard an awful lot about the fact that that too needs to move faster. And yet, again, it seems that it's very hard for Germany to get on top of that.
Yeah. It's one of the big differences in moving here 6 years ago from the UK, where digital business models were very, very common in every sector at that stage. Telecoms, energy, but really across the board. To come here and find that a lot of shops you have to pay with cash that wouldn't take card. The energy market, as I've said, it was very paper-based. And it was a real surprise to me, this, as an outsider, this economy that I perceived as being incredibly efficient and advanced felt like it was stuck sort of 10 years in the past. But if we look at what we have now in the energy market in Germany, one great example, we have more batteries, consumer batteries, than any other market in Europe, by far. We have this enormous resource that we could be using to balance the grid, to store energy on a windy day. But the vast majority of those batteries sitting in households are not connected to the grid in any intelligent way. There is no smart meter. There is no way of telling what is the charge level in those batteries. How much energy could we store? How could we use those in a smart and intelligent way? And the beauty is when you have those hundreds of thousands of batteries, we're not talking about draining people's batteries from 100% to zero in a matter of hours just because there's a shortage on the network. It's about careful management over the periods of days and weeks and using that as a long, slow, steady storage of energy. But we're not even making use of that today.
What would have to happen for us to do that?
So every single one of those batteries should be connected via a smart meter, and that data should be accessible to players in the energy market who can find smart and intelligent ways to optimize their use without consumers needing to turn down their heating, without consumers needing to know when to put your laundry on. And there are ways to do this. We ran a trial in the UK last year where we offered consumers that we would pay them to use energy for a 2-hour window. So we knew there was going to be an excess of wind on the grid. It was a Sunday afternoon. We knew demand was going to be small. So we said, well, what if we just told people, sent them an email, said in this 2-hour block, we're going to pay you to use energy. And then we let the consumer decide. And the collective impact of all those customers who got that email and paid attention and made some small changes at home, the collective impact was equal to the single biggest battery storage in the whole of Europe. So at a cost of almost nothing, we created a virtual battery that would have cost millions to do. And so I think there are lots of ways where we can use what we have today just in a smarter and better way and make energy cleaner and cheaper.
Ortwin, where do you think the hurdles lie for a scheme like that. One thing that just flashed in my mind when I heard Andrew was information, sharing of information. Is there a hurdle there? I don't know, whether based on GDPR or even just cultural attitudes.
Well, I think there's a set of factors that influence people's behavior, specifically in terms of digitalization, which you said. The one thing I think on the German entrepreneurial side is the quest for perfection. And I've seen that all over the place, that, unless you have the perfect digital solution, you don't do anything. And there's no experimentation or to trying to do something and then to correct it again. We've seen it with so many things. It's the app for the coronavirus and so on. Oh. It costs millions and millions and millions. So that's one thing, is it's this quest for perfection. The second thing is the Germans are, for whatever reason, very sensitive about privacy issues. Yeah. So, you have to deal with that. It's a part of whatever cultural heritage, maybe something that is from back of history that people don't want to be watched. And we need to have solutions that give them sovereignty over the data. So that's an important element. And coming back to what you said, I mean, we've done experiments with several of these kind of, smart meters, or even just smart devices. One of the things that is actually low tech, but worked fairly well, is to have a traffic light in each room, or even on your smartphone, that says if it's red, electricity is expensive, if it's yellow, it's okay, and green, it's cheap. And the good thing about this was people knew that nobody was sharing this, what they were doing. So the people have a lot of anxiety that the utility knows when they use a lot of energy. Doesn't really, give any big privacy things, but it we've seen a lot of concerns. The same thing as what you said about sharing batteries. We've done a lot of focus groups in Germany about sharing car batteries, and the people wanted to have 10 times as much money for this than the utility was willing to give. Because they gave all kinds of excuses, like, if my car is in the garage, and sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning I want to get a pizza and then I can't get out. Really stupid stories, but they showed this kind of, sensitivity to this. Mm-hmm. And number three,
they show, for me as a journalist, they show the need for information.
Well, it's not just information. I think they do have information. It's there is a very strong, very strange, sensibility to the idea of co-ownership, to the idea of sharing something, and also that a lot of Germans have the feeling, the company, the electricity company, is my enemy. It's not my friend. And that's strange. Yeah, if it's smaller, it's different. But if it's one of the big companies, it's your enemy. And then it gets very difficult to get them along. So I think we need very intelligent solutions to this. Clearly, digital solutions. That's very clear, because otherwise we cannot have the Energiewende what we need without having a very good digital monitoring, admonition, and distribution system.
May I just pick up on something you said? A question for you, Ortwin. Do you think it is mostly people have an issue with the fear of change itself, and once change has happened, are then much more accepting, or do you think there are some fundamental barriers within culture here in Germany that need to be overcome?
I think there's not so much a change issue. I mean, there's also something. I mean, if people are feeling that they're economically doing well, then they are very reluctant for change, because they say it can only get worse.
So if people are well off, they're less open to change than if they're not.
Yeah. That's how we can see, and actually between countries, but also within each country. But the second point is it's this this fear that somebody could, penetrate the privacy by getting access to data that are not they don't want to give. And the funny thing is, if they go to Google, they share everything.
Instagram,
they share everything. But as soon as electricity utility company comes in and says, I want to install an automated system that, for example, balances, we can see, at least at this point, 60 to 70% of all the households that we asked said no. And that's so. But if you give them an automated system that they can see, the one thing is what acceptance in Germany is extremely important is what we call self-efficacy, is that they can determine how much they save. And if they can do that, if they feel we are in control, then it works.
Yeah, agency.
Yeah, it's agency, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, before I want to move on to the money side of all of this, but before we do, perhaps just a word from you as an industry voice in reaction to what we just heard there. People don't trust their energy companies. Does this help?
This
it helps
does
me.
help.
I love it.
This does help, actually. No, in all seriousness, it really is true. And then the number of customers we see who ask us a question, we answer the question to our customer service team, and their reaction is, we don't believe you. We don't believe what you say. We're going to wait until we have the proof, but we don't take it at face value. And initially I found that really quite disappointing, that people weren't willing to believe us. But it's with good reason. People have had terrible experiences, particularly with energy companies in the past, but not exclusively. I tell a story when I do our onboarding for new joiners about one of our early employees who was signing up for a high-speed internet tariff, and he got locked into the second year of the contract, but with the kicker that the company then said, well, if you read down to page 43 of your AGBs, you'll discover actually we're allowed to turn down the speed of your internet connection. And they did that in order to squeeze even more money out of him and say, well, to restore the speed you wanted, you have to pay more again. And so there are a lot of very smart, intelligent people out there figuring out ways to extract the maximum value from customers at all costs. And I think, unfortunately, in energy, that's incredibly true. And even very recently, we saw some really shocking behavior on the price comparison sites and the way in which energy tariffs were presented. So it's with good reason. And I think the best thing we can do as an energy company that thinks differently and treats people differently is just to keep showing people and demonstrating that what we say is what we do. And we can't rely on just people taking us for our word. We actually have to prove it to them, and that takes time.
We were talking earlier about the letters we're all getting now from Gazag and Vattenfall and so on. And I was thinking after that, language is part of it too, really, isn't it? Because these letters are so hard to penetrate until you get to the numbers in the little box. And then if you start doing the math, it's clear. But it's all very, very obfuscatory in a way.
It's very difficult for people to really understand what's being said. Secondly, there's a lot of legal language there where people feel also, very, cautious because, the language, of course, they know that is something that they don't understand. And then, as you said, the bill comes later. And thirdly, it's not clear, that the company who sends out this letter wants to help these people. I think that's the attitude is always, yes, this is a legal requirement and we have to do this. Since we have met the legal requirements, nobody can sue us later on. It's not, what does the customer really want from us? How can we help them to pay for the window bill? Can we give them some, let's say, specific financing scheme? That even low-income families can go along with all the price hikes they will face. And I've talked to a lot of electricity companies, but also with large builders and apartment owners, apartment housing owners, and I say, well, you have to send them letters or communicate with them about this is what you can expect. This is how we can help you to pay back the money that we need, and this is what we, offer you in terms of, let's say, installments, or that we have a saving scheme that you can pay in money right now every month, so that if the bill comes in January, February, there's something out there that you can use at the time, and we give you maybe an extra, interest rate on this one, and the government could also help there. So it's basically, yes, we have to inform you that this is going to be very expensive. You can, of course, take another company, but this will be more expensive, and buy it or die. And that kind of language. It's not ill meant, but it's a legal department that produces it. It's not a communication department.
Yeah. So let's drill deeper on the price tag. And Andrew, you said in your opening remarks that we haven't fully understood what's coming at us. And in fact, obviously, Octopus is dedicated to making the Energiewende fairer and cheaper, but certainly that is not the impression people have, that we're going in that direction. It seems to be going in quite the opposite direction.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately the worst is yet to come for households. So most customers are on an annual contract that runs from January through to the end of December. Most households are supplied by their local incumbent, their grüner. And most of those customers are going to be getting letters around middle of November time telling them that their bills starting 1st of January are a multiple of what they've been this year. So most households haven't seen any impact so far, but that is coming, and it's going to be really, really big. When I think about that, I think about customers like the one of our door-to-door sales agents was talking to earlier this year. He was talking to a couple. They immigrated to Germany some years back. The German's not perfect. They certainly didn't understand really how the energy market was working. And they were contemplating moving to a smaller flat because they couldn't afford their heating and electricity bills. And so they phoned up their local Stadtwerke who was supplying them and said, look, we're really struggling. And the Stadtwerke's advice was turn down your thermostat. They didn't offer them any other tariffs. They didn't offer them any other support. Just turn your heating down. And when we sat down with them, when we looked at the price they were paying, they were on the most expensive tariff that the Stadtwerke offered. Mm. And we could save them a third on their energy bills by having them move to us. But even then they were skeptical. Eventually they did sign with us. A week later, the Stadtwerke went round to their door with a pre-filled contract, cancelling the switch, and persuaded them to switch back to the Stadtwerke.
Wow.
So this is happening. That is the experience that a lot of people currently have. They don't understand the energy market. Even when they're offered help or support or a different alternative, they don't know which way to turn. And they end up trapped. And those people in particular, come the 1st of January, are not going to know what to do and are not going to know how to pay their energy bills. And that worries me a lot, because it's fine talking about switching and talking about smart metering and everything else, but we also need some really targeted support this winter for those people.
So let me get Ortwin's point of view, because as I mentioned at the outset, you are a specialist in environmental sociology, and that has rarely seemed so crucial as at the current moment. First question would be, we've already seen isolated demonstrations, but not huge scale and only in certain regions. Would you expect that to get worse? Would you expect there to be real political upheaval as people begin to realize the full scope of this?
Well, it depends a little bit on how either policy or politicians, and also, as you said, the Stadtwerke and others will behave in the next 3 months. If that happens, what you just said, and if that becomes a rule, that people will get a bill in January of saying, okay, your energy bill will be 3 times higher, and if you don't pay, we'll evade you out of the building, or you will get no electricity anymore, we're going to have a very hot winter. So I think that's the point. I think at this point, yes, we see that there are a lot of particularly on the political right, there are, demagogues who are just waiting for that moment to come.
Yeah.
And they're already mobilizing and already want to make sure that people are unhappy, because then they can mobilize, just like with the pandemic, just like with the refugees. So they don't care what the reason is. They just want to get people that are dissatisfied to make a big demonstration against government and against democracy. And I think that's scary. And what I want to say is that at this point, it's still not too late to do something against it. I think on the political side, it's very important that we show that we're really serious about social justice. And I think, we have these
So
three.
what does that mean concretely?
It's
Yet more relief packages?
No,
How far will the one we have now?
Well, I think what the government should do at this point are two things. But one is, I've already mentioned, is having a tariff structure that is progressive, providing fairly cheap energy to people who don't use much of energy, and then if they use more, then they have to pay more. That it's not so difficult to implement, and it would show specifically the people that don't have a lot of demand that they can pay for that. And the others who have a lot of money can pay more. The second thing is, the relief packages right now are kind of in, just Zeit had made a calculation, the rich get more than the poor. And again, this is not what people expect. And as a matter of fact, we made a big survey just last months about, where we asked, should we pay specifically the poor people more, and should we just not give the rich people more relief? The people that have income more than 5,000 said more yes to that question than the lower people. It was really interesting because the people who are rich in Germany feel that they have the responsibility to, have that kind of transfer. Not everyone, but it was more than 50%. So I think that's the political goal, is on the two sides, a progressive tariff plus a very tailored relief program for those who definitely need it. And it should be just income. I think, everything else should give them a little more money that they can pay for energy. And I said, on the private side, I think it's very important that all these private companies that provide housing, that provide energy, that provide whatever other kind of services, are getting in contact with their customers directly and make with them a plan how to make sure that whatever more burden is being brought upon them, that can be somehow, socially packaged, or can be, communicate with them about what they can do and how they can actually help them to get over the winter. I think those things are crucial. If that's happening, I don't think these, demagogues will have a lot to recruit anymore. If it doesn't happen, I'm more pessimistic.
Andrew, 2 points come up for me when I hear what both of you are saying. One is, in a climate like this, where people are worried, where they don't yet fully know what's coming at them, where the winter could be very tough indeed. You said we need to scale up the Energiewende now, but how much willingness will there be in a population that's already quite uncertain? That's number one. Number two, and perhaps this is in a way the answer to that question, both of you have emphasized the need to empower citizens, to really give them a sense of agency in shaping their energy situation according to their needs. And again, concretely, what needs to happen to do that?
Yeah, okay. So it is the willingness there. I think the willingness won't be there if we don't communicate it in a way where we can explain to people the practical and positive outcomes, the potential to use less energy, to save money. And I think whatever we design, whether it's in the world of smart metering or energy efficiency or anything else, we need to be communicating the benefits. And I think that's why work like yours, Ortwin, is so important. I do think for too long in Germany in particular, we've neglected the end consumer in energy. We talked a lot about nuclear, about renewables, about grids, about all the technical stuff. But we haven't had a national discussion about the end consumer. And I think we really, really need that. And that's a way then of empowering people, of making them feel part of the conversation, of breaking through this lack of trust that we have. But I think it's really heartening to hear a lot of the statistics, sometimes it's easier to assume people don't want change. They don't want wind farms. They want things to be as they are. But actually, the numbers tell a very different story. People are positive. They, more often than not, people want renewables. And I think we just need to tap into that, bring along the people who are much more negative, but tap into the majority and work with that and use that to build momentum. So for me, it really needs to be government-led. I think ultimately we need that commitment and that push from government that then can drag industry and the population along in a positive light.
So we have government sitting here, Ortwin. Tell us if you would, but I'm going to ask you to speak to industry as well. But first of all, what would be your top 3 priorities that you would want government to act on now? This group right here, but of course also their bosses.
Yeah. Well, I mean, partially I'll have to repeat myself because already it was early on in this topic. So number 1 is really introduce a progressive tariff. So that's number 1. I think that's something, not just making it cheap for the first 100 kilowatt hours, but have a progressive tariff. We have it with income. Income tax is progressive. Why don't we do it? And it can be easily done with anything that goes through pipes or through grids. I mean, you can. A little bit difficult is it with gasoline on cars, but you can also do it there. There are good models out there. So that's number 1. Number 2 is target your relief packages to those who need it. First, you don't have the money to relieve everyone. And secondly, people are very concerned about social justice. And if they feel that the money is given to everyone and that people who don't need it will have more money, the whole effect can be gone, and it's of no avail. And the third one is, and I think that was echoed now, do a better job in communication. I mean, Habeck, I think, is doing quite well in communication. Of course, he's now a little bit imitating himself. And that can be a danger. But Scholz is not a very good communicator at this point. I mean, it doesn't come along as an empathetic, caring person, which is needed at this point. And so I think that's, you can't change people if they are the way they are. And then, of course, if you fake them, it doesn't work. But it's an important element. But I think he does have that kind of feeling, and you should actually make it much more visible to the outside world. So those are my 3 things.
And top 3 to industry?
Well, number 1 for industry is really, talk to your customers and develop a plan in which your customer is not going bankrupt, is not going to be, out of heat or something else. And if you develop a joint plan that still keeps your business running, I think that's what you said and what you're doing. It's great. I think that's number 1. Number 2 is, I think it's very important that a business is enhancing the Energiewende and trying at this point to make sure whenever they can replace any fossil fuel with something else, they should do it. And it will pay off, because for industry it will not get cheaper, the fossil fuel. And the third thing is, I think that we need to integrate mobility, heat, and electricity. And electrification is, one of the major elements there. Heat pumps were mentioned before. That they think in those integrated way of sector integration, and also innovative ways of, one waste of one industry can be a resource for another, but also in energy we can have waste heat that can be used for others. So this kind of integrated thinking is something which I think is more needed than ever.
Thank you very much. Andrew, your reaction to that, and then I want to ask you one final politics question.
Okay. I think, a great list. I would add one more thing to that, which is my ask from government is more big, bold decisions along the lines of exactly what Ortwin outlined, but also fewer small tweaks. So a good example, the gas levy that was introduced this summer, and then shortly followed up by a VAT reduction that almost equaled out the gas levy, but not quite. Created an enormous amount of uncertainty for our customers. We had very large numbers of people calling us, trying to understand what this meant. And actually, at the end of the day, it meant almost nothing because the two effects net out against each other. But it created so much additional stress and uncertainty and not quite panic, but unnecessary stress for consumers. And I think, stepping back, quite easy to say, did we need another levy at a time when we knew consumers' bills were going to skyrocket? No, actually, and we should have stopped and thought about how else.
So direct relief to the companies with that when they're hurting.
Exactly, and take that out of general taxation. So yes, more big bold decisions, and less time spent on.
So big bold decisions. Tweaks. Last question: if you were chancellor for a day, what big bold decisions would you take on that day? What would be your top three?
So my top three, number one would be what Ortwin said, which is more targeted support for the poorest. I think it sounds like there's the support within the populace for that. I think it's also the right thing to do, frankly, and that those of us in a fortunate situation should be contributing more to helping solve that problem. So that would be number one. Number two, I'd pick something actually quite technical, which is smart metering. We have almost no smart meters in Germany. Other European nations have 50%, 80% of households on smart meters, and that's enabling them to do some very smart and clever things about optimizing the energy system. So why not get that kick-started and say, look, the first 100,000 smart meters in Germany are free. Let's get them installed, let's get them government funded, and kickstart an industry. Let's kickstart learning what we do with that information, how we communicate it to consumers. Let's be bold. Let's commit to that. And then I think thirdly is staying power. I think we know where we're going, we know the long-term vision, and we just need to stick it out. Right. It's a very, very volatile time, and it's easy to get blown off course. But I think we just need to stick at it.
Thank you very much to both of you. Wonderful discussion to hear. Let's give them a round of applause, and then we want to hear your questions.